15-mark question. Discuss supply side policies in the UK that could be used to stimulate economic growth. Now, this is why I emphasize doing past papers so much, since this question is just repeated all the time. This was the same question in 2023, same question in 2022, and the same question in 2017, and they were all 15-mark questions. Now, of course, every year the question has a bit of a different wording. So for example, in 2022, it was discuss the benefits of an increase in infrastructure spending on the UK. So one of your paragraphs would have been a supply side policy. The 15 mark in 2023 was market orientated strategies that the Angolan government could use to improve development. Yes, you talk about supply side policies and then you'd link it at the end to development. Yeah, so a bit of a twist on it. Then 2017, discuss looser fiscal policy and supply side reforms that the governments can use to increase economic growth. So 2017, pretty much the exact same question as this. This is why you need to go through these past papers. And the harsh reality is the students who don't attempt these past papers, who don't try write these essays, make a model answer. So if this question comes up again, they know exactly how to answer it. They will score exponentially worse than the students who are doing the hard work, doing the boring past papers, but using these videos to try and improve and help them reach that A star. There just will be no comparison, and you can just tell that in the depth they respond. The first time you're writing a supply side policy question, there'll be so many gaps, especially with real world application in the chain of analysis, but repeating it, doing it 1, 2, 3 times, improving from every single time, you'll get up to a point where if a supply side policy question comes up, you pretty much know exactly how to answer it and you can smash it out of the park. Now, straight from the Edexcel exam board, in response to this question in 2024, they said it's clear that this question is well rehearsed and we saw some excellent responses. Now, to emphasise this point, remember grade boundaries are relative. They depend on the cohort and how the cohort performs on that particular question or that particular paper, which is a deficit you're going to have to make up in probably a harder question, which is of course a lot harder to do. So it's really about these popular questions, these high yield questions, you need to practice them. But anyway, let's actually get on with the question. First things first, also, the question doesn't just say supply side policy, it says policies. So to reach that level 3, you will also need to reference 2 different policies to, like I said, to get anywhere close to that 15 marks. Now, also, before we get started with the question, this is of course a section B question, so you would normally think I need to use the extract for the application, but in reality, we've looked through the entire extract. The only real bit of application is this last bit of extract B, I believe it is, where it mentions how the government have a 20 billion plan to spend on like carbon capture, which create new jobs. But this again emphasizes, to get these application marks around 50-mark question, 3 marks there for application, you need to also know your own examples, you need to know your own industries, your own real-world example of supply-side policy, and maybe some stats, some figures to back that up. So I have gone through the supply-side policy of apprenticeship subsidies in a previous 15-mark question, but this time I actually will type it up so you guys can see the full extended chain of analysis and exactly how I would write it. But let's get started with this. So how would the apprenticeship subsidy act as a supply side policy which could stimulate economic growth? So firstly, what type of supply side policy is an apprenticeship subsidy? And that's probably how I would do my 2 paragraphs. I'll probably do one on a market-based and one on an interventionist. And of course, if you don't know that, market-based is where the government decreases intervention in the market, and then of course an interventionist when they increase intervention in the market. And of course, a subsidy would be increasing intervention in the market. They're getting more involved in the market, more involved in the price mechanism. Therefore, so yeah, apprenticeship subsidy is an example of an interventionist supply side policy. This apprenticeship levy was introduced in 2017, where large employers pay 0.5% of their wage bill to fund this training. Now that is a great start. Another great start you can throw in 2022/23, there were 337,000 apprenticeships started. So how does this apprenticeship subsidy actually work? So just like any other subsidy, it lowers the cost. And for firms, it lowers the cost for training. Therefore, if it's lower cost to train apprentices, it means firms are more incentivized and they're more likely to take on apprentices, thus meaning the quantity of apprentices taken on due to the subsidy increases. Now, of course, if more firms are taking on apprentices, if there's an increased quantity of apprenticeships, it will mean that the level of skills in the UK workforce, in the UK population, is improving. Another really good bit of real-world application you can link this to is, let's think about who benefits the most from these apprenticeship schemes. So the most common people who go into, the most common individuals who go into apprenticeships are 16 and 18 year olds, so maybe fresh out of GCSEs or fresh after A level. Now why does this matter? As this is the young workforce, and the young workforce face disproportionately higher levels of unemployment than the national average. For example, in 2023, youth unemployment was 11%, whilst the national average was 4%. So that's over 7 percentage points higher unemployment rates. Now, another factor that compounds this, if you think about the demographic of the UK population, again, real world application, the UK has a massive aging population crisis. There's lots of old people. And what does that also mean? It means more people are retiring. And these individuals, these workers who are retiring, they are essentially at the top of their skill set. They've had 20, 30, 40 years of experience and now are leaving the workforce. Therefore, we're losing those skills, we're losing those expertise, and most importantly, we're losing those workers. But apprenticeships also help solve that problem as well. The aging population is therefore being replaced by new young workers who are retiring, since we do have an aging population crisis. Now back to the main chain of analysis. The increased level of skills will therefore, we say, increases the level of human capital. And if there is a higher level of human capital within the UK, it means there's an increase in productivity. And what do I always say? What does productivity mean? It's output per unit time. And if there's an increase in output per unit time and per worker, so every worker is more productive, every worker can produce more goods and services per unit time. What is that going to improve? Of course, that is going to increase the real GDP, as what is real GDP is the amount of goods and services produced in the UK. And if per unit time we can produce more, of course the quantity of goods and services will increase. But essentially the end bit is that increase in real GDP. And just the written down version, increase in human capital, increase in the level of human capital, increases labour productivity. And what does labour productivity mean? If labour is more productive, they have more output per unit time. And if there's more output per unit time per worker, it means firms can produce more goods and services. And of course, if firms can produce more goods and services, it leads to an increase in real GDP. And then of course, it would not be a supply side policy question if you did not include a good amount of diagrammatic analysis. So of course, price level on your y-axis, real GDP on your x-axis, would draw a nice LRAS, and then shifting that LRAS out, of course, so LRAS1, LRAS, then also AD and shifting out AD. Then also you have a nice little AD curve, and of course make sure you label up the points. So we see PL1, I'll label that, and then YE, and then of course we see the increase in real GDP from YE to Y1, so of course 100% label that up on your diagram, mention it on your diagram, make sure to label up the rest, and we see a little bit of deflation, or you might call it disinflation. So of course the increase in productivity, the increased skills in the workforce would cause that LRAS to shift out. So of course it won't be a supply side policy question if you did not include a diagram. So use your diagrammatic analysis. So this increase in labour productivity, this increase in human capital, essentially the increase in productivity would cause our LRAS to now shift out to LRAS1, and that of course would lead to the increase in real GDP from YE to Y1. And what is an increase in real GDP also called? That is economic growth, which you can end your chain of analysis on there. And if you really want to mention and you want to add a bit more, you can also shift out the AD to AD1, AD2, and you can mention how if workers are more productive, they have more bargaining power, they can demand higher wages. This increases level of consumption in the economy. If workers are more productive, it means more output per unit time, more goods and services being produced. Firms are making more profit, they're more likely to invest more, increases consumption in the economy. And of course, with the government subsidising this interventionist scheme, this apprenticeship subsidy, it also means the level of government spending is increasing. So again, increase in C, an increase in I, an increase in G. You can also say an increase in exports. Of course, we're making more goods and services, so we can export more. So of course, it does lead to an increase in AD, and again, more economic growth. Now look at this absolute piece of beauty I've crafted for you guys. So I've written up that entire chain of analysis to make sure, of course my handwriting it gets a bit dodgy sometimes. But yeah, this is just the epitome of A star. Like everything about this says A star. Beautiful KA, beautiful diagram. Like I said, you don't actually need to add the second link to AD. You can just leave it with one AD curve. But of course, this 15-mark question is not done, and this paragraph is not done without evaluation. So let's move on to the evaluation stage of this paragraph. Now, the first evaluation point, and the absolute classic with regards to supply side policies, is of course, however in evaluation, this depends on the time lag. One underrated thing I want to mention about practicing past papers is students will look at section Bs and look at the Edexcel paper as a whole and think this is almost impossible to do under time pressure to an A-star level. But this is where the A-star students aren't just A-star students because they can write the chain of analysis. It's since they've gone through these past papers so many times, when they're sitting the actual paper, there's so many questions that are very similar that they can just almost, instead of having to rethink an entirely new chain of analysis, instead of having to think new evaluation points, they can pretty much just recall once they've already written and chain of analysis they've already written. Therefore, another massive underrated thing, it massively increases their speed. Now, in my own experience, the top level of students, the pinnacle of the A stars, that is one big reason why they do not actually struggle with timing. since they've just got so many reps of these questions. They know exactly how to do these chains of analysis that at one stage it essentially becomes recall, where they're just recalling chains of analysis, they're just recalling evaluation points instead of actually having to think about them and think about the process and think about the chain. It's just simple recall. But anyway, back to this. However, in evaluation, this depends on the timeline. As of course, we usually say any economic policy that we implement takes around 12 to 18 months to have any effect inside the economy. And this apprenticeship subsidy, of course, the effects of increased productivity, the effects of LRAS increasing, of course, are in the long run. So it could take even longer than 18 months. And of course, subsidising these firms is going to be quite costly for the government, and especially depends on the stage of the business cycle the UK government is in, and also depends on how the government's fiscal balances are. If the UK is in a fiscal deficit, if they're in a budget deficit, subsidising these firms, providing the supply side policy, is going to be extremely taxing. And of course, in the short run, it's going to worsen the fiscal deficit, but the positive effects will only be seen in the long run. So 100%, the stimulating economic growth does depend on the time frame, as it takes 12 to 18 months for the government policy to be implemented to see any sort of effects in the economy. So therefore, in the short run, we will not actually see any positive effects on economic growth. And of course, that little bit to the fiscal deficit, you can link that to this being an interventionist policy. Since of course, interventionist policy, they usually use some of the government budget, they usually use government spending, whilst market-based policies, they usually either don't use government spending or somehow generate tax revenue. Now, another classic one, I'm not going to go much in depth with, is opportunity cost. Of course, these funds could be allocated elsewhere and it could be more effective. For example, you could even say the carbon capture, for however in evaluation, they could allocate these resources to the carbon capture, which with cleaner electricity generation technology could be more effective. Also, more specific points like the quality of apprenticeships that they're subsidising, since there's lots of employers who use apprenticeship schemes just for really cheap labour and do not actually focus much on training these individuals. Therefore, if the level of training is not satisfactory or is not high enough, yes, the government are subsidising lots of apprenticeships, but the workers are not becoming highly skilled, their level of human capital is not increasing, thus of course limiting the degree to which economic growth, which real GDP increases. Also, another really simple but great evaluation point, the question is asking how supply side policies could stimulate economic growth. Economic growth, why do we want economic growth? Of course, it's a government objective. So then what else? How else could we evaluate this? We could say the trade-offs with other government objectives. And if you look at this diagram, with both LRAS and AD shifting out, we're getting some quite substantial inflation. So you could say, however, in evaluation, this depends on the trade-off with other macro objectives, as it could lead to high levels of demand pull inflation. That's a really good evaluation point. Or if you want to word it a different way, maybe it leads to a budget deficit. Then you could mention the interventionist policy uses government spending and the opportunity cost of that. And yeah, that is how I would do the first paragraph for this 15-mark question. I'm not going to bore you and do another paragraph. You can just pick whatever other policy. The chain of analysis is very simple. Just make sure you know another policy, another type of supply side policy.